So Ethan, what do you think? If a computer debated against a human, would the computer win or the human?
Surely the computer, Mr. Herring.
Oh, well, fortunately for all of us who are into debate, you are not correct. Since last week, IBM's Project Debater went up against a human debater.
And lost.
Well, wait, and what?
And lost?
And lost? Yes, the computer. Of course, the computer lost. But it was closer than we might have expected. They did world's parliamentary format, and with the way that worked, they were polling the audience before, in the middle, and after, and the audience was with the computer during constructive speeches. But
Wow.
It all fell apart during rebuttal. Why do you think it fell apart during rebuttal?
I think that a human would have a lot of different avenues of thought to take during a rebuttal and could also, weigh values a little bit better than a computer could, because a computer can pull all the facts that it wants. And if I'm not mistaken, the computer probably shouldn't bring up new information like later in the rebuttal speeches anyways. So its ability to pull up facts would not be as effective in later speeches. And humans can just take a lot of different ways of thinking than a computer can.
Well, fortunately for all of us in debate, that's pretty much how it went down. That the rebuttal speech on the computer side ended up looking a lot like a repeat of its constructive speeches, but it didn't really have the ability to listen to the opponent and analyze and respond effectively in rebuttal. For my money, that's really where debate actually happens. That's where it gets fun. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to What's the Res, an ongoing conversation about the current resolutions in the world of high school debate. My name is Josh Herring. I'm a debate coach at Thales Academy, Rolesville, and I'm joined today by Ethan Delves. And today we're going to be debating, we're not going to be debating, we're going to be discussing the latest resolution for Lincoln Douglas debate. Ethan, read us the resolution.
Today we're going to talk about drugs. The resolved is the illegal use of drugs ought to be treated as a matter of public health, not of criminal justice.
And I guess we probably should just get this out of the way. Neither of us are partakers of illegal drugs.
Yes, not a partaker of illegal drugs.
Excellent. Well, now that we've cleared our names there, I think we have one bit of business before we get to it. We actually have some listener feedback. We got a question emailed to us from a student named Lucas.
That's right.
Ethan, what was Lucas's question?
So Lucas had two questions. The first one was he wanted to know if this episode was going to be about same-sex schools, and I told him no, because we're going to be talking about drugs, and it's going to be a lot of fun. But his second question was, do you believe in the Keynesian view of economics?
Well, I think I'll speak for myself and say that I do not believe in that view. I think the Austrian school of economics that sees economics as reflecting human action and being all about the study of human action is a much more effective way to think about economics. Ethan, where do you stand on the theory of Keynesianism?
So I think that the Keynesian view, just to clear the water a little bit, is saying that government investment in the private sector is the best way to keep an economy going. And I would have to disagree, because I think that people know how to spend their money better than the government does. And when people make all of their own decisions and place their money wherever they please, all of those separated interests will come together and form a more holistic economy that is less focused in really concentrated areas, and it's just an overall more spread out way of thinking.
Excellent. I think that's a sound way to go about it. Though we should both definitely recognize that for debate purposes, John Maynard Keynes is a helpful voice if you get assigned a position like plenty of us will be debating in tomorrow's debate tournament on with the Coolidge Foundation. Well, with that, Ethan, let's shift gears. This is our first debate, this is our first episode looking at a Lincoln Douglas format. So let's take a moment and make sure we help our listeners understand a little bit about values debate. So help me with this. What's a value in terms of Lincoln Douglas debate?
Okay, so my favorite way to talk about a value is a way to weigh facts. And the kind of differentiating between public forum and Lincoln Douglas debate here is in public forum debate, you usually do have a lot of facts on each side, more so than I would say an LD debate. And these facts can come from all of the different contentions and different areas of argumentation, all stemming back to whatever burden you have on the resolution. But in an LD debate, you still do have facts and you make contentions just like you would in any kind of regular debate. But you can't debate without a value. And a value is what you attach your contentions to give them weight in the round. And it's usually just one word or maybe even a phrase that describes what is your highest standard for the round so that all of your arguments can go and stem back to that and prove why under your value that you can win the round.
That's a helpful definition. Can you give us some examples of values that you've used in LD rounds?
Sure. So I've encountered values. Social justice is one of them. Utilitarianism is a really popular value, especially for a lot of negative cases out there. Freedom is a value that I see a lot as well. So yeah, those are three of them that I see a lot and pretty consistent throughout debate.
Okay, so we're looking then at kind of a highest principle that really is going to be a reason for why we're affirming or negating the resolution that's presented.
Right, and when you're doing LD debate, you'd always want to present your value first before your contention so that the judge has a clear framework for where the round is going. You present your value, and then the judge knows what to look out for in your contentions so that those things can then point back to the value and give your case more strength.
So one of the ways to consider a case as strong or weak is then to look at whether or not the contentions line up with the value.
Right, and then whether or not your value weighs more than the opponent's.
Okay. Well, where does this whole thing called a value criterion come into the case structure? How does that work?
A value criterion comes directly after the value in a LD case, and the criterion is the way to measure whether or not you've achieved the value. And there's a lot of examples that people use here. When I see, like, for example, when I was doing LD debate for a previous resolution of military aid, the negative team had a value of safety. Oh, sorry, the value was utilitarianism, and then the value criterion was safety. And then they gave a number and said that once we reach safety and this type of security for this amount of people, then we have achieved the value of utilitarianism. So it's a way for their case to have soundness so that when their case is able to prove that it can reach this standard or the criterion by measurement, then they have inherently reached the value.
So in an LD case, then I give my value, and that's kind of a broad overarching principle, but then I need to connect the value to a value criterion, which is going to be something much more objective and clear that I can achieve or not achieve as according to the way the case goes.
Right, and this helps the judge determine whether or not you've actually reached your value, and for the opponent as well.
Okay, well, I think Ethan, how in a nutshell, how would you explain the difference between values debate versus policy debate? How are these two different kinds of debate?
I think that values debate incorporates a lot more morals, and these highest principles that you put into place are really deeply attached to the arguments, while in public forum debate or any type of policy debate, you'll have a ton of facts on each side, and it can kind of overwhelm the judge a little bit and overwhelm the other team. People usually spread more in policy debate and public forum debate to get more facts and more arguments out to make it more difficult for the other team to refute this amount of arguments in a certain amount of time. That's why I prefer LD debate, is because when you have a value, your arguments mean something. Like each argument that you give, I usually give about 3, can attach to something that's intangible, but it has meaning and it gives weight to what my argument is saying so that it's not just facts laying around, because you can't really recognize the burden of what facts are giving without having something valued in the first place or establishing a value before you even give your case.
Sure, and one thing I'd probably add on top of that is that at the highest levels, and in high school it takes a couple years before students really get there, but it's pretty standard in college LD. I'm really looking, as a judge, I'm looking to see that students are bringing some philosophical sources to bear. So if you're going to invoke utilitarianism, I'd be looking for your case to have a tie to John Stuart Mill's essay on utilitarianism. Or if you're going to talk about the social contract, I expect you to give me a quote from John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, some of the social contract theorists, and I'm expecting that to really be part of the case. So really, even the source material is going to be a different way of thinking about the debate, whereas that really doesn't come into policy debate as much.
Right, yeah, you definitely need that central philosophy at the beginning of your case to help give the judge and the opponent a direction for where you're going.
Well, and just so we make sure we do also get this on the table, even in LD, do we still need a clear case structure?
For sure. LD cases, I would argue, are maybe even more structured than the rest of the policy cases because they do have a lot more aspects to them, while policy cases do tend to have more impacts, the value and the value criterion, and then implementing every aspect of different types of contentions afterwards. I would say that LD cases, you need to be careful about the way you structure it so that the order of understanding goes from a large principle down to a way of measuring that, and then down to each part of the contentions afterwards. So it's kind of like a pyramid, except upside down.
Okay. That's a fantastic way of thinking about it. Well, with that, let's kind of shift into looking at our resolution. And Ethan, I thought it'd be a good way to start if we kind of both give our initial reactions to what we see in this resolution. So
Right.
when you look at this resolution, what's the first thing that kind of leaps out at you?
Right. So just to read the resolution one more time, it says the illegal use of drugs ought to be treated as a matter of public health, not of criminal justice. My first reaction is, what? Does this mean everybody can do cocaine and heroin and just go around and get high on everything? And that was honestly my initial reaction. I was really surprised by this resolution. I thought the negative team was going to clean house, because why not punish people for doing drugs? Like, everything I've heard, drugs are bad and people will hurt themselves if they get access to it. So therefore we should put them in jail and decentivize them from doing drugs. And now that I've read a couple more sources on it, my views have changed a little bit. I'm sure we'll get into that later on as we discuss some arguments.
I think we definitely will, because that's interesting. Because I would totally agree with you that I think we have a very strong social agreement across really all ages that drugs are bad.
Right.
I had a season in life where I loved the TV show South Park, and there's a character on there, Mr. Mackey, whose recurring line is, "Drugs are bad, okay? Drugs are bad." I think we can all agree on that part, but certainly that's one of the things that this resolution is really getting at. See, I look at this, and this immediately leaps out to me that this is going to be a debate that is all about prison rates.
Right.
And who is incarcerated because of these laws, and is it actually fair that the people that are incarcerated and for the amount of time that they're placed in prison?
Right, and what's the best way to help these people? Is the best way to prevent them from doing drugs in the first place with this very hard fist that says you will go to jail for this amount of time for doing this sort of drug or having this sort of drug? Or is the best way to deal with this to help people who have already fallen into that trap and aiding them in getting out? And what's the effectiveness there? Which kind of like, this is why it's an LD debate, is because you're weighing the effectiveness of two very different options and all of the implications that those options have.
So really on the one side, we have the affirmative is proposing a change in the status quo and arguing that the way we've been treating drugs in terms of a national war on drugs that we'll get into in just a moment is really ineffective at its goals.
Right.
Whereas, and we need to try something different. And the resolution even proposes that different approach in terms of suggesting treating illegal use of drugs as a concern of public health. But then the neg is then affirming the status quo and looking really at this is a breaking of the law and this is a matter of criminal justice and how do we prevent people from breaking the law.
Right. I totally agree.
Well, with those kind of first impressions in mind, let's kind of, I'm going to do a little bit on then the status quo and jump in where you see fit. Part of the status quo on this is that we ought to keep in mind that from 1971 until the present, the United States federal government has been involved in what is called the war on drugs. This was proclaimed by President Richard Nixon, and it's been affirmed and implemented by every president since then. We'll put this link in the show notes, but a group, drugpolicy.org, has a really good video where rapper Jay-Z does a 3-minute video that really shows the history of the war on drugs and how ineffective it's been. Really, the trick is that drugs have been part of the Western world for an awfully long time. World history classes tend to focus on the Opium Wars as an interaction between Britain and China, and part of that is the unfortunate and really horrifying introduction of opium into Chinese society by the British as a way to take over Chinese society. But then really in the United States, there was a time when cocaine was part of Coca-Cola's basic formula. That's part of what why people enjoyed drinking Coca-Cola. But from the 1970s onward, you really get a change in United States drug policy where different levels and access to drugs and then usage of drugs become criminalized at increasingly defined levels. And as the law changes, we get a change in how people are treated when they're found with drugs and then incarcerated because of that. Leading us really then to the status quo, where as of 2018, we have over 2 million individuals imprisoned in the United States, and just over 450,000 of those are imprisoned for nonviolent drug-related crimes. Now, that's from the Prison Policy Initiative's 2018 study, and we'll put that link in the show notes. And the only other thing I wanted to include in the status quo is that over the last 10 years, the cost of the war on drugs has skyrocketed. As CheatSheet.com shows, the U.S. federal government has spent over $243 billion over the last 10 years fighting the war on drugs. So part of this resolution, as all resolutions do if they're well formulated, it has its issue on the face of it, but it also draws in questions of racial considerations, and then questions of where the U.S. federal government should spend the tax receipts that it collects. We've all been thinking recently about the national debt, is because we have a debate tournament on that resolution tomorrow. Ethan, where would you see, could you suggest anywhere that we could repurpose $243 billion if we were no longer fighting the war on drugs?
Oh, the affirmative team could totally eat this up. If we had $243 billion extra dollars, this could totally go towards paying off the debt and so many other places as well. Like, just because we're focused on the debt, that's where my mind first goes to, where we could use this to help pay down interest rates, because currently, as I stated in the previous episode, we spend about $378 billion per year financing the debt. So this is a big amount of money that has been spent on the war on drugs, and it could be used to cover almost an entire year of debt interest.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Ethan, anything you want to add as far as status quo?
I think that based on my initial reaction to the resolution, first I was like, wow, everyone's going to be on drugs. This is crazy. But when you look at it from a bit more of a deeper perspective and not just a surface level, one of the biggest burdens of the negative team is to prove how effective the criminal justice system is at actually solving this problem. And seeing that it's gotten worse and more costly over time, we can't really see from any different angles whatsoever how the criminal justice system has helped promote people getting off of drugs or keeping people out of jail, seeing that 2 million people are in jail right now. Granted, not all of them for drugs. I think you said 1 in 5 are there for nonviolent drug-related crimes. But is this really a solution, or is this just a way to put people away who are doing these things to keep them away from the people who don't? So I think that the affirmative team has a very strong case to say that we have a way of actually solving this problem.
Well, before we get into some of that affirmative material, I know you've got a lot prepared for us to help us think about public health as an option in just a moment. Let's not skip over the grammar of our resolution, because of course here we've got this phrase, illegal use of drugs. Ethan, is there anything in particular we should be concerned with about the phrase illegal use of drugs?
Right, so just pay special attention to the fact that this is specifically forbidden by law as an action that is prone to addiction and horrific life consequences. So I think that the negative team would want to kick those negative life consequences a little bit harder and maybe flush out a couple of those just to show drug usage is a very serious thing. It has these consequences, so therefore it should be criminalized to prevent it. But the affirmative team, again, is taking a different, innovative, and lighter approach, saying that there's a different way to handle this. So we can move on to the next term.
Yeah, because certainly with that, as part of those horrific life consequences, the negative team would certainly want to hit on the fact that the deeper someone goes into drug use, the more those drugs strip away his ability to make a free choice. It's part of the addictive power of these substances that really people lose the ability to make obvious choices there. And that has a lot to do with a lot of why this has been criminalized. Now, when we think about that next phrase, treated as a matter, then we're really, that's a pretty ambiguous phrase.
Really?
There's a lot of things that could happen with that. Are we talking about the way people generally think about it, and that kind of like the sort of pop culture reference I made earlier with Mr. Mackey and the drugs are bad sort of thing? Is that what we're talking about here? Or are we talking about the way it's treated by the court system? Or are we talking about the way it's treated in legislation, Congress, the House of Representatives and Senate? Are we talking about by states? It's a very ambiguous phrase, and there's a lot that we could that needs to be defined there. So that's going to be a key area of clash between these two cases, I expect. Now, so Ethan, help us with that last bit. I mean, we're clearly given a weighing resolution. So
Right.
how do we handle the weighing resolution in terms of the structure of the resolution?
So weighing resolutions are my all-time favorite. In the first episode, I talked about my favorite resolution being about the Internet of Things versus the harms to personal privacy. Those are two distinct things, Internet of Things, harms to privacy, that we got to weigh using a value. And this is another one of those resolutions, a matter of public health versus a matter of criminal justice. And I love weighing resolutions because they are the best resolutions, in my opinion, at attaching to a value. Because all of the contentions can line up and attach to their own value, one on the affirmative, one on the negative. And the final speech is my favorite speech because you go up there and prove how you have attached your contentions to the value best and which team should win because of that. So for this resolution specifically, value criterions are going to be extremely key, and the affirmative has to show that public health is the better route, while the negative must show that criminal justice is the better route, which is the status quo. And both sides should be specifically formulated under their definition of what treated as a matter means, because that's a really key phrase, and like you said, it's an extremely ambiguous phrase. I think that based on the values that we'll talk about a little bit later, this will kind of become more clear, because once you have a value, it's way easier to weigh the resolution. But the most important thing to pay attention to here is hitting all of the different angles that you can put under your value. Because like I said on the negative, or sorry, for the affirmative side, refuting the negative side, there's cost, there's ineffectiveness, there's the number of people in prison, what they could be doing to contribute to the economy, or maybe even help pay down the debt if you're looking at the Coolidge resolution. So there's so many angles for the affirmative to attack on ineffectiveness. I would expect that there's also a good number of angles that the negative can attack for the effectiveness of the criminal justice system under that key phrase, treated as a matter, so that we can really help weigh the resolution, because the more different angles you have, the more convincing it is to a judge that your side should win, because you help encompass a more holistic view of the nation rather than zoning in on one point.
Sure, and that holistic view is key as long as it's all kind of bound together by the value.
Right.
I know that's always a temptation for LD debaters to kind of for their cases to sprawl, but the heart of this kind of case structure is that the value really holds it all together. Well, when I was thinking through this episode, it seemed to me there were several things we just kind of we need to talk through in terms of just topics that we just need general awareness of before we can really get to any kind of suggestions for what people should think of with their values. So I thought the first one of those we ought to start with is really the racial implications of drug enforcement and black incarceration rates.
Right.
The ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties American Civil Liberties Union.
There we go.
Yep, that's it. They have a position paper on this that we'll link to in the show notes. But they look a lot at the fact that there is some immense racial bias displayed in the enforcement of these laws. And I mentioned earlier one of the video I watched by Jay-Z. He proposes a scenario that strikes me as having a ring of truth about it, where if you have two different groups that are both participating in the consumption of illegal drugs, one of those is far more likely to be busted by the police and to then actually go to prison than the other. He proposes that if there's a group that is partying in a poor tenement section of New York City, as opposed to a group of wealthy, affluent Wall Street bankers who are partying, and both are consuming illegal drugs, the poor tenement housing that is going to be predominantly Latino and African American in ethnicity, that's the group that's going to be busted, and that's the group that's going to be in prison. So I think part of that, as we think about this resolution, we've got to consider the reality that we have a vast racial imbalance in the way these laws are enforced.
Yeah.
Ethan, what did you find? You found some information about St. Louis to that effect. What did you find?
Right, so St. Louis is an enormous, and I would argue a really good example as a whole for the affirmative side. But just to pick one of the key facts out of there, it was talking about how 17,000 people are incarcerated in St. Louis every year, which is the largest amount of people yearly for the entire state. So that city has the largest amount of people out of all of Missouri. Mm-hmm. And the ratio from black people to white people in that ratio would be 1,064 to 138 incarcerated.
Could you say those numbers one more time?
1,064 people of color to 138 white people.
I am.
That's crazy.
Oh my goodness, those numbers are really shocking.
Yeah,
And
that doesn't line up.
no, it really doesn't. And I suspect that I suspect that there are an equal number of Caucasians who are partaking in drugs. The issue here is not that African Americans use drugs more often. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the issue is that white folks simply are not being caught as often.
We need to catch the white people.
that.
That's it.
Oh, that may be an implication. So that suggests here that there's something unfair is going on in the enforcement of these laws.
I would completely agree.
Well, so let's think about the affirmative side for just a moment. If the affirmative side is to go forward, that's going to change the focus of the law. Ethan, how would the law shift under the affirmative case?
So I would think that the affirmative would start with a value here, like racial justice. I know is something that we talked about a little bit earlier, and I'd like to get a little bit deeper into. But this is, going back to the definitions, definitely a court issue. So the affirmative would have to have a more hard definition of this rather than just the way people view things, which was another suggestion that we had for the podcast. But this would include definitely changing the law like radically, because if that ratio is just really different, and it's definitely a very disproportionate ratio. So that means that there's definitely something wrong going on where certain people are being caught, certain people aren't being caught. And I honestly don't even know where the government would start in changing law enforcement to make that ratio more even, or catching all the people who have possession of drugs.
Well, and certainly in this case, we're dealing with an already overburdened prison population.
Right.
And we have the one other thing that may come into bear here is the concept of recidivism, or return to prison, where people are incarcerated on a charge, they're released, but now that they have, and in part because they now have a police record, they have trouble getting work, and they
Right.
end up returning to the same activity that got them placed in prison initially.
Again, another aspect of why the affirmative team has a better solution than the negative team, because the affirmative can help solve this problem without people having to go to jail, get a felony stamp on their record, and then not be able to find work afterwards. I can totally see the affirmative making an argument for an economic boost, or with all these new contributors to the economy, and people just being overall healthier and happier after going through something like rehabilitation instead of being put in prison for a long time.
Well, speaking of those economic boosts, there's certainly a lot of new economic activity happening in Colorado. Ethan, tell us what do you know about economic activity related to drugs in Colorado?
Right,
I'll fill in with a few other details here in a moment.
Colorado has legalized marijuana, and this means that people are taking advantage of this opportunity and wanting to sell marijuana in order to make lots of money. And I know that you had a number for how much money that Colorado has made. I know the entire legal marijuana market worth is $146.6 billion, expected to be at least by 2025. It's a little bit less now. But in Colorado, people are moving to Colorado to grow weed and then sell it and make a ton of money off of it. And some people consider this a problem because already rich venture capitalists are expected to move there, take advantage of the business opportunities, and then increase the amount of money they have by even more and more. And a lot of people think that those people that are already high up are going to take advantage of this situation and just make more money for themselves, and not everybody else can keep up. But I would have to disagree. I think that that opportunity could be taken up by a lot of people if they act quickly.
Well, it certainly could be, and it's an interesting conundrum because we've got an activity that has landed literally hundreds of thousands of people in prison, and I think there's certainly an argument. It would take a mental leap to get there, but an argument to be made for drug dealers as entrepreneurs and effective businessmen. Now, all of a sudden, the same activity that landed those businessmen in prison is being used by legitimate above-ground above-ground market, not participating in the black market, but above-ground market, to then create new economic resources. And they are not desiring to hire the same people who are currently in prison for their quote-unquote business expertise.
Right.
Now that's there have been an awful lot of new marijuana business lines. One that I just find absolutely hilarious is the proposal that of several beer companies that are proposing to the same beer products but soaked in marijuana leaves.
What?
Oh yeah, marijuana.
Get drunk and
beer.
stoned at the same time.
It's the new business market of 2019. There's all kinds of new possibilities. But of course, this all got started because of the idea of medical marijuana.
Right.
And that, when I was in college, I remember Michigan had they opened a medical marijuana dispensary in Lansing, I believe, or it might have been Grand Rapids. But there were a couple towns where they had those, and it became sort of a joke. I mean, that if you found the right doctor, you could get a note, and so on. But that really the trick here is that marijuana has a lot of pain relieving capacity, so there is a legitimate health option on the table.
So just to kind of clear this up a little bit, where is the argument there as far as medical marijuana is? Where does that fit into making this a public health issue or a criminal justice issue? Is this saying that if we have more providers of marijuana, that the cost of medical marijuana would go down? Or how do you fit that into the resolution?
Well, see, I would look at that as part of the history of how we got to there. And I would fit that in really as context, because there's for the last decade, there have been more and more public arguments about using marijuana as pain relief for terminally ill patients and patients whose diseases create immense chronic pain.
Right.
So the idea was, this really was the opening of marijuana into kind of the public discourse, that it became, the idea was presented that this is how those in this position of pain are going to have pain relief. And then it was only a step further to say, well, wait a minute, if marijuana is not bad for those who are terminally ill, maybe it's not bad for other people as well.
And not only this, but marijuana can be grown. It's not a synthetic sort of drug that has to be manufactured and perfected by all of these different companies, especially large companies that would have to go through hundreds of checks and hundreds of processes in order to get this done. Marijuana is a plant, and it can be grown, and it's not too many more steps after that where it can be turned for a medical use. So I would say that for the affirmative can look at it, or just providing it as context even, that marijuana is faster, I guess you could say, at least the procedure is a lot faster than a lot of the other drugs out there for pain relief.
Which all of that is part of why it's often considered to be a gateway drug. And people who begin their drug addictions will start with marijuana, but if the purpose of their consuming illegal narcotics is to pursue a high, the trouble is that the brain adapts very quickly to what it considers to be a high and the release of the chemicals and the combination. So marijuana it provides that for a season, but then they're chasing something harder, and that then leads to heroin or cocaine or meth or to some other sort of narcotics. So what may begin as a maybe justified, maybe unjustified medical marijuana prescription could eventually lead into harder drugs.
And imagine if the affirmative team made this as a matter of public health. If someone was going into rehabilitation to try to get off of something like marijuana, they would walk out of rehab and go to their local Walmart, and there'd be marijuana sitting there on the shelves. Like, how effective of a solution could the affirmative team make this, as opposed to the solution currently of criminal justice to actually help people live healthier lives?
Well, I think there's I'm not entirely sure where this argument would fit in, but as you were describing that, it made me think that what this is effectively doing is it's putting what are currently considered to be harder drugs on an equal level with tobacco and alcohol.
Right.
And that it's really moving opiates and it's moving marijuana to the point of nicotine. And then moving this less of a matter of justice and violating the law and to more of a point of wisdom and people's individual choices.
Right, I would completely agree.
Well, in that case, I think we've really finished up the kind of areas of conversation I wanted to hit on. I'm sorry. There's one other thing I wanted to make sure we get out. That one other big argument I think on the affirmative side is less philosophical and medical and so on, and more practical and economic. Because, of course, if this does become a legal industry, if in application of the affirmative position, all of these narcotics become legal products to be cultivated, bought, and sold in the United States, that becomes a whole new area of regulatable and taxable business for the United States federal government and for state governments and local communities.
Right.
Now, of course, that also has a direct impact on the current avenues through which these illegal drugs come into the United States, that being primarily drug cartels from our nearest southern neighbor, Mexico. If these drugs are all available freely, then we no longer have Mexican cartels that are profiting off of a legal scenario created by the United States federal government.
Right.
Okay. Well, all of that being said, let's shift to our next area. Ethan, tell me your thoughts on this question. Is addiction an illness?
I don't think so.
No.
No.
All right. In which case, why on the affirmative should we consider this to be a matter of public health?
So that is a really hard question to answer because addiction, like the negative could argue that it is a matter of intentional choices. And I can completely see that. I think that's definitely a surface level view on it. If you choose to take a drug, you are most likely going to get addicted to it. And then after that point, I would think that it is an illness because it gets harder and harder and harder to actually get off of this. But the original spark or starting point would be an intentional choice. So I almost think that there's both of these at play here. But again, each team has to take a stance on this question because the affirmative certainly leans more towards the illness stage for it wanting to provide solutions such as rehab, while the negative is saying this is an intentional choice that we can prevent. However, can you really prevent it? Because again, there's a black market and all these implications of making it legal and reducing the size of the black market. So this is a really hard question to answer. I think this is definitely the most the mind-boggling part of this entire debate for me is the illness versus personal choice. But I think for now, I'm going to stick with the intentional choice.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I like how you laid that out, that really both affirmative and negative are taking a stance on this question through their argumentation. And really, because affirmative needs to show that this is an illness in some way in order to meet the burden of a matter of public health. Whereas really for negative, this is going to be about showing, no, this is a matter of choice, and choices that violate the law fall under the purview of criminal justice. So that really is going to be a lot of what's going on for this debate.
So what kind of values do you think we're going to have for this debate?
Well, as you've heard already, I think this debate is going to come down to a lot of arguments about prison rates and who is incarcerated and for what reasons. So for those reasons, I would suggest a value of racial justice.
Right.
And defining that as equality before the law for people of all races. And then looking at that really becomes the rationale behind why we need to affirm this resolution. Because currently, racial justice is being violated in the status quo by a predominantly Caucasian police force focusing on those who are racially different from them in how they prosecute the law. So if we change the law, we then remove the ability of this predominantly Caucasian police force to enforce the law in a racially biased way, thus achieving a value of racial justice. So what do you make of that?
So I completely agree, first of all. Your racial justice value, I think, is a great value. However, my only concern with that is how many arguments can you make under the racial justice value? Because, again, I'm in complete agreement. The stat I read earlier is a number of over 1,000 to a number under 400, which is a completely disproportionate ratio. But I think by making a value that's purely centered around racial injustice or promoting racial justice is missing a lot of the really clear benefits that we can see from making this a matter of public health. Because remember, when you lay out your value to the judge as racial justice, all of your arguments have to follow under that. I think that if we made the value just a little bit more broad, yet maybe combated that with a really solid value criterion, we could help encompass all of the aspects of making this a matter of public health that would really push the negative team to search in a lot of different areas to help prove that criminal justice is more effective when the negative team evidently has less aspects to focus on than the affirmative can handle.
So would you accept freedom as an alternative value? Would freedom be broad enough to kind of fit all the benefits that you're seeing?
I think that freedom is, I would almost argue that's a little bit too broad. I think we could sort of find a middle ground there. It might take a little bit of digging because freedom is a value, like I said, that I see commonly a lot of debates. And I think the reason people use really broad values is because there's a lot of different ways to define it to help it work for different sorts of cases. So I think racial justice is a little bit too narrow and freedom's a little bit too broad. And I can't really think, what else do you think? Because now I'm kind of stuck. You know what I mean?
It's the trick of finding a value is that you've got to find the highest possible principle.
I think that we do have, maybe it would have something to do with government obligation, because I feel like there's a lot of, making it a matter of public health would help people, get jobs because not as many would go to prison. This would save the government a lot of money. from what is right now the war on drugs. This would also help promote racial justice in the law enforcement area. So there's a lot of different areas that we can attack this from. I'm wondering what sort of value would it be able to encompass all of those while keeping it specific enough for a judge and an opponent to
See, well,
to
then maybe
chew
we
on.
could go with democracy as a value, and then the value criterion would then be equality before the law.
Equality before the law, or maybe something like maybe quality of life. I'm almost thinking quality of life. That's
Could be,
a
sure.
very common criterion that I hear, but I think quality of life is going to be a criterion that's heavily used in the tournaments to come with this
Now
debate.
that makes sense, because you could look at democracy in terms of the rule of all the people, which would encompass some of the racial stuff I've been laying out.
Right.
And then the problem there, and then quality of life would then look at the fact that if we are wrongly imprisoning too many people, we are lowering their quality of life, and this would then affirm. I think we may have found our way to a mutually agreed upon value
Right.
system.
I think
there.
democracy is definitely closer to a type of value that we're looking
All right.
for.
Well, why don't you just lead us off on neg? Where should neg go?
NEG has to lay down a very hard fist and say rule of law, because drugs are not an illness. They're an addiction that stems from an intentional choice, and rule of law, rule of law, rule of law, and no exceptions. Because drugs are bad, the negative team has to be able to flush that idea out very clearly, and we cannot take any risk of legalizing drugs, and all of these things that could potentially happen are definitely too bad to even consider making this a matter of public health for the risk of having these things come into place. So the negative team has to, again, weigh this against the affirmative team, and all racial emphasis would actually disappear from the negative side of this debate, which gives the affirmative team a really good opportunity to attack back. But rule of law, I think, is going to be one of the very few values that negative has to choose from, because negative has a very narrow pool of contentions to choose from for why criminal justice is better. I feel like the affirmative team has a lot of ground to pull from, and the negative team does have a solid foundation of why drugs are bad, but they have to be pretty selective about what contentions they pull from this, because their rule of law is, in my opinion, one of the only values that would actually work for the negative team and help build a sound case.
Well, I think I'm with you on rule of law, but I do think there could also be a case for, in this case, bringing freedom up as a value for the neg. But
Which you just proposed for the affirmative. So
I did.
Can you put that
That's-
in a negative context? Because I've been in debates where the affirmative and negative team have the exact same value, and that bothers me sometimes. Like,
It
how
does.
Could you do
well,
that?
I mean freedom in a particular way. So this may be a case where the debate, if that happened in this case, we'd have freedom in maybe in two different perspectives or two different definitions, because it is a very ambiguous term. I mean, but in this
Yeah.
case, I'm talking about individual freedom, and particularly preserving the ability of the human person to make free choices. This would then give really some. This would give a lot of some philosophical ground to our LD debate, because this would let the negative side really appeal to the libertarian freedom of the human person as part of what the government is designed and intended to preserve. So what this would then need to look at, this kind of argument would look at the way that drugs really enslave people, and they remove their ability to make rational choices. And so that really the reason why we would be upholding this current standard of criminal justice would be because the government cannot, by definition, affirm people enslaving themselves to another substance.
And again, I kind of see the value criterions coming together here too, because the affirmative criterion that we just proposed was quality of life. If we use your value as freedom for the negative and define it as such, I can almost see a public health come in, or maybe, again, quality of life for the people, because making rational decisions, I would argue, is a very key aspect of a good quality of life, and having those decisions being able to be carried out under something like a democracy. So I see a good clash with values here, but I think that there is a little bit of overlap, which is kind of hard for me to grasp, because in the last debate I did see a lot of overlap, and then the cases just got so convoluted, and it was almost like each team was arguing for each other. But I don't expect that to happen with this debate, because I think each side is extremely different.
We've got a lot of strong clash here, and now I forgot to mention them earlier, but on particularly on, I thought I had them. I'll put some recommended contenders or some recommended philosophical sources in the show notes for AF and neg, but I've got the neg in front of me. For neg, really, I think if you were going for rule of law as your value, you could easily pull in John Locke and looking at the concept of the social contract, or if you were feeling a bit more ancient Greek, you could pull on Sophocles and his concept of the moral fabric of reality, that when that's violated, there's real harm done. But really and then for freedom on neg, you could easily look at a philosopher named James K.A. Smith. You could look at Augustine, or you could look at Aristotle. All of them tie together the concept of freedom and desire and how those things really relate to propel our choices and make our choices real.
And I love this quote that you put down here that says, "We are desiring animals more than we are rational animals." That's really deep. You know what I mean? Because that really gives the negative something to stand on when it kind of shows that the affirmative team has this ideal world in place where everybody can get off of drugs through a program that helps the government save money. And the affirmative is almost taking an idealistic approach to this, when the negative has to, as it usually does, take a very practical and pragmatic approach where it's saying, no, this can't happen, here's why it can't happen, because human nature goes like this.
Yeah, that quote comes from James Smith's book, Desiring the Kingdom, and he lays out a philosophical application of some concepts developed by Augustine of Hippo, a philosopher and bishop in the 4th century A.D.
Of Hippo.
Of Hippo. It was a town in northern Africa. I don't know why it was named Hippo. Maybe they had lots of hippos. Who knows?
Probably.
But he argues there that actually one of our Enlightenment ideas from Rene Descartes is wrong. Rather than us just being rational animals, picking and only rational in this reasoning sense, we actually are much more desiring animals. So, which is, if we recognize that, it's really helpful. And the trouble is that if we're desiring animals, we do not always desire the right things.
Right.
So if I'm enslaved to my desires, I need to be protected from my own desires, which is where I think this could be pretty helpful on neg, to say that actually this is a place where people are being enslaved, and it's the government's job to protect people from their own desires in some way.
I really like that argument. I think one thing that makes this resolution especially good is it being a weighing resolution. There is so much ground. Like, I would say more on the affirmative, because it's arguing for a change that we don't have now. So the affirmative can pull from a lot of places that we don't know necessarily how it would be, because it is not the current state. But this resolution, I really, really like this resolution, because there's so many places where you could argue that are attached to the resolution where you don't need to go into some off-space area and pull from some weird definitions. I think this is a really solid resolution.
Well, it's going to be kind of fun. I expect you'll probably take this to the March 9th tournament if you're able to make it. I'm sure our wonderful sound engineer, Noah Berman, who will also, if he's able to make the March 9th tournament, he'll also take this one. That'll be at the Dogwood Speech and Debate League novice tournaments at a classical school down in Fayetteville, North Carolina
Noah
on
Berman
March 9th.
seems to like that idea.
So that'll be quite fun. Well, let's wrap this up, Ethan, with do you have any advice you would want to give anybody who is thinking about this resolution? And we're only 2 weeks away from this being the resolution that everyone doing LD nationwide will be debating. So any suggestions for folks looking at this one?
Right. So because this resolution has so much weight and so many places to pull from on each side, I see this debate starting with some really solid definitions on both sides, going to a good status quo on the negative side of the way things are, laying out really good values. But I think, and what I would expect, is that if each team lays out their contentions, the last speech is going to be all about battling through that one point that has just seemed to carry all the way through the round, that each team just cannot stop arguing. And I would advise against this, because this debate is so beautiful in the place that the values can be really solid and really well attached to the arguments. So in the final speech, weigh the resolution. Take advantage of the fact that it's a weighing resolution and use that to show the judge why your case as a whole is better than the other case as a whole. Kind of tell it as a story almost of two different worlds, the affirmative world and the negative world, and which world should win out. And definitely don't spend your last speech battling out on one or two simple contentions that don't really encompass the entire round. Take advantage of the wording of the resolution and use it to help you win the debate. And for just some simple case writing strategies, definitions will matter. But I think what's definitely going to matter is the values, which always matter in an LD debate. I'm not going to diminish that for any other sort of round. But in this debate, I can hear values ringing through every single speech for an LD debate. I think the affirmative is going to have some really interesting takes on the value, the negative as well. But I am really excited for some affirmative values on this debate. This is going to be a really good one.
Well, those are some great thoughts, Ethan. The only thing I'd add is that really I think it's important for everybody looking at this case to really take the reality that LD is a values debate and not policy debate seriously. Because there are plenty of policy type arguments and facts here, but this kind of resolution that is dealing with the illegal use of drugs and whether it ought to be a matter of public health or criminal justice, this is a great resolution to really dig into the philosophical views of justice, the purpose and nature of government, and really the purpose and nature of human beings. And what happens, are we simply exercising our nature when we consume drugs? Is that something that we can do and still be good human beings? Or are we doing something different in that moment? And is that difference something that ought to be weighed and ought to be prevented? Really, these are the questions that should drive this debate. And really, I love your language of two different worlds, because ultimately, this debate should come down to two strongly clashing philosophical paradigms about who people are, how government works, and whether or not people need to be saved from their own stupidity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today on What's the Res, an ongoing conversation about the current debate resolutions in the world of high school debate. My name is Josh Herring. Today I've been joined by Ethan Delves, and Noah Berman is our sound engineer. If you like what you've heard today, please go to iTunes, leave us a 5-star review, and help others know about What's the Res. Ethan, if our listeners have any feedback or questions for us, how can they get in touch with us?
Listeners, if you want to send us any sort of feedback, you can email us at whatstheres@gmail.com. That's WHATSTHERES@gmail.com. Or you can follow us on Instagram at whatstheres_.
Join us next time for What's the Res, where we'll have an interview with one of the leaders in the Coolidge style of debate.